The day Registrarconvener Oshit of the Vethrani Archival Authority arrived at my library, Chalk was asleep under the returns desk. She had been asleep under the returns desk, in various configurations of that same fundamental arrangement, for 11 years. Not 11 years without interruption. She got up for food, and for water, and for the slow constitutional we took every morning along the gravel path that ran behind the community hall and through the gap in the hydroponics fence, and for certain specific moments during the borrowing day, when a patron she had decided she liked came through the door, and she felt the occasion warranted standing. But in aggregate, if you averaged it out across the full span of her life in this building, Chalk had spent approximately 11 years asleep under the returns desk. The folded canvas jacket I'd put down there in the beginning was long since shaped to her. She'd compressed it into a kind of shallow bowl, and she'd spread the gray hairs of her belly into the surface of it until the jacket and the dog were continuous, which they were. Chalk was a quiet old mutt, and she slept the way old dogs of her type sleep, completely, as if sleep were the primary activity and waking was the occasional interruption. I want to be clear about what she looked like, because it matters later. She was medium-sized, though she had settled into a sort of comfortable broadness that made her look more substantial than her actual dimensions. Her coat had been, in youth, a warm tawny brown, and was now that brown plus gray, not evenly, but in the way of older dogs, faded at the muzzle and around the eyes and along the edges of the ears, so that the gray read less as age and more as a kind of gradual accumulation of weather. She had very large, very quiet paws. Her ears were long and lay flat most of the time, unless something interested her, in which case one or both of them, usually the left, would lift slightly, like a question that the dog was considering but hadn't decided to ask yet. She did not bark very much. She had not barked very much since she was about 2. Barking, in Chalk's opinion as I'd come to understand it over the years, was for situations that warranted urgency, and almost no situation, in her view, warranted urgency. Things happened. Things resolved themselves. She slept through most of it. The library had been here for 22 years, which was longer than I had been its librarian. I'd taken over from Mace Hallstrom when he retired, which was 9 years ago, 2 years into Chalk's tenure, and I had inherited with the job a set of keys, a card catalog that was still partially physical for reasons I'd never entirely sorted out, 3 mismatched reading chairs, a wall of civic record binders that went back to the township's founding, and a dog who had apparently been sleeping under the returns desk since Hallstrom had brought her in as a puppy and had never been formally asked to leave. I had not asked her to leave either. She was very good company, which is the kind of thing that sounds sentimental until you've spent 9 years working alone in a building full of quiet, and then it doesn't sound sentimental at all. It sounds accurate. There is a particular quality to a day in a small outpost library. The borrowers come in 1s and 2s, mostly in the morning, occasionally in the early afternoon when the township's various working schedules leave gaps. The civic record queries come from the community hall administration once or twice a week. Someone needs to confirm a boundary notation or verify the date of a founding ordinance. The rest of the time it is just me and the building and the slow, regular work of maintaining a collection, cataloging new materials, repairing damaged spines, processing the transit case updates that come through on the courier runs, keeping the index current. It is not exciting work. It is important work, in the way that all the unglamorous, load-bearing work of a small community is important, not glamorous, not noticed, until it stops being done. I had come to understand in 9 years of doing it that a well-maintained civic record is a kind of quiet promise to the people who live in a place. It says, what happened here was noted. It was filed correctly. It can be found. I kept that promise, every day, in the way you keep promises that no one is watching you keep, which is the same way. The township was called Narenfall. It sat at the outer administrative margin of the Vethrani archival zone, which is a formal designation meaning that Narenfal fell within the regional jurisdiction of the Vethrani Authority for purposes of record-keeping, zoning compliance, and civic classification. In practice, this meant that approximately once every several years, a delegation from the authority would arrive, process the township's records against the current version of the Vethrani zoning doctrine, verify that the classification codes were current, and leave. We were a small town. We ran a weekly market, a medical clinic, a lending library, a community hall with a permanently leaking roof, and approximately 812 human residents. The Vethrani found us very boring, which suited us fine. The inspections were procedural. They lasted a day, sometimes two. The registrar-conveners were always polite in the way of people who regard politeness as the most efficient tool for managing minor civic matters. Ashit arrived on a Tuesday. I heard the transport before I saw it, the low tonal shift of a Vethrani administrative carrier settling onto the pad behind the community hall, the pitch it makes when the dampening systems cut in, like a tuning fork held underwater. I had been reshelving the civic record binders that I'd pulled out in preparation for the visit. The authority always sent advance notice of inspections. I'd had 2 weeks and had used them to make sure everything that was supposed to be in a binder was in a binder, and that the binders were correctly labeled, and that the labels matched the index I kept in the top drawer of the main desk. Chalk, who had also been informed of the inspection in the sense that she had been present when I opened the notification on my tablet and said aloud to no one in particular, "Right, they're coming Tuesday," had taken no steps to prepare. She had considered the matter of an upcoming Vethrani inspection and had concluded that her preparations were complete, which they were, because her preparation was already done. It had been done the entire time, as she understood it, and did not require any adjustment. I heard the carrier door. I heard footsteps on gravel. There were 3 of them. Ashit led. He was tall for a Vethrani, which meant he had to duck through my door frame, which he did with practiced ease. He'd done this before, in other small township libraries on the administrative fringe, and he knew his own dimensions well enough to navigate them without thinking about it. He was a registrar-convener of senior grade, which I could tell from the width of the trim on his collar and the document case he carried, and he had the efficient, forward-moving quality of someone who always knows where the next item on the list is and has already begun moving toward it before the current item is finished. Behind him came 2 junior officers, Assessor Dial, and a second one whose name I didn't catch initially, and who would turn out to be a new appointment, in the sense that she looked as if this might be her first outpost visit, and was taking quiet notes on a tablet held horizontally across her forearm. Ashit introduced himself. I introduced myself. He told me they expected to be finished by end of session, which in Vethrani administrative vocabulary meant by late afternoon local time. He asked if the record room was through the back. I said it was. He thanked me. He and the junior officer with the tablet moved past the main desk and through to the record room. Dial stopped briefly. He was younger than Ashit mid-career, by the look of him, and he had the slightly more relaxed quality of someone who has done enough outpost visits to have let the formality wear down a little at the edges. He looked around the library the way people look around a room they're mildly curious about, taking inventory without urgency. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the reading chairs. He looked at the returns desk. His gaze went to Chalk. Chalk at this point was still asleep. Her breathing was visible, the slow, rhythmic lift and fall of her ribs, the slight curl of the long ears against the compressed jacket. She was not aware, or at least not visibly aware, that 3 members of the Vethrani Archival Authority had just walked past her. Dial looked at her for a moment, then he looked at me. I said, "That's Chalk, she won't be a problem." Dial nodded once. The way someone nods when they are acknowledging what you said without quite agreeing with the framing of it. He followed Ashit into the record room. The morning proceeded. This is what a Vethrani administrative inspection looks like from the inside of a small township library. You sit at your main desk, and you are available to answer questions when they emerge from the record room, and they emerge from the record room at intervals. About every 40 minutes, on average, someone appears in the doorway and asks where a specific binder is, or whether a specific record exists in physical form or only in the digital index, or whether a particular boundary notation refers to the current civic boundary or the pre-adjustment one from 14 years ago. You answer each question. The answer is almost always one of, it's in the green binder, second shelf from the right, it's in both forms, and it means the current one, the pre-adjustment one, was a survey error and is noted as such in the annotation. The morning is, from your side of it, very quiet. You reshelve the materials you didn't need after all. You do some cataloging. You make tea. You drink the tea. In the first hour, Ashit sent out the young officer for the founding charter binder and the supplementary zoning annotations for the Eastern Quadrant, both of which I had pre-pulled and left on the small table by the record room door. She collected them efficiently and thanked me and went back. In the second hour, Dial came out himself and asked whether I had the original site survey from the township's initial civic registration. I did. It was in the deep archive cabinet under the window, a physical file, not digitized, in a folder that smelled of the particular elderly paper smell that I associated with all of the original founding documents. I retrieved it for him. He opened it at the desk and read the relevant sections with that careful, steady attention that I'd noticed when he first walked in, and then he copied the relevant notation onto his tablet and thanked me and took the folder back into the record room with him. I made a note that I would need to refile it before end of session. Chalk slept through the first 3 hours of it. She woke at approximately the second hour and a half, roused by some internal signal I'd long since stopped trying to identify. A vibration in the building she registered before I did, perhaps, or a shift in the light, or simply the biological clock that told her it was time to surface and reassess. She raised her head. She looked around the library with the calm, comprehensive gaze of a dog who has been asleep and is now deciding whether to continue sleeping or to engage with the world. She yawned the long, low, unhurried yawn of an old dog, jaw wide, tongue curling, ending in a faint sound that was mostly breath. She looked at me. I looked at her. "Inspectors," I said quietly. She considered this. She looked at the doorway that led to the record room. She put her head back down. It was around this point that Ashit himself came out, not with a question about a binder, but to stretch his legs, which Vethrani administrative officials of a certain grade do when they've been working in a small records room for a couple of hours. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment looking out at the gravel path and the gap in the hydroponics fence. Then he turned around and noticed Chalk. She was awake. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the middle distance slightly to his left, in the way of dogs who are tracking something below the threshold of human perception, or who are simply looking at a point in space that happens to be near you without it meaning anything about you specifically. Ashit said, "The animal is a registered companion, I take it." "She is," I said. "Species?" "Canis lupus familiaris," I said. "Common domestic dog. She's a mutt mixed ancestry, about 11 years old." Ashit looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone running a mental cross-reference. Then he said, "Earth companion animals are subsentient, terrestrial category 6. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the delivery of a classification, offered the way a registrar offers classifications, as settled things, not requiring response. "That's what the file says," I said. He went back to the record room. "I want to be honest about something. I have had this conversation, or versions of it, more times than I can count. Every official who has come through this library in the 9 years I have run it has noticed Chalk at some point and has felt the need to categorize her, and the categorization is always the same. Subsentient, terrestrial, category-coded, non-concern. I have never argued the point. It is not my job to argue classifications with administrative officials, and in any case the classification is, in the narrow bureaucratic sense, accurate. Chalk is a dog. She is not sentient in the way that matters to Vethrani taxonomy. She does not speak or use tools or engage in formal reasoning of the type that would trigger an upward reclassification. She is just a dog. An 11-year-old mixed-breed domestic dog with a gray muzzle and very large quiet paws, and the flat, patient attention of an animal who has already decided everything about every room she has ever been in. Just a dog, sleeping on a folded jacket under the returns desk of a small outpost library, as she has done, every day, for 11 years. I've thought about this sometimes in the quiet afternoons, what it means to be classified. The Vethrani classification system is thorough. I have read enough of the Heritage Code and its associated documentation to understand how it works, the broad architecture of it. There are tiers for cognition and tiers for behavioral complexity and tiers for social organization and tiers for what the code calls, in its slightly stiff translated terminology, the capacity for situational authority. Each tier has criteria. Each criterion has indicators. Each indicator has a measurable threshold. Below a certain threshold, you are filed as non-concern and the file is closed and the question is considered settled. The question is never the animal, of course. The question is the label, and labels are about the people who apply them. Chalk had never been consulted on the question of her label. She would not have cared if she had been. The courier arrived at about the 3rd hour. He was Vethrani, a records courier for the Central Distribution Network, which runs physical transit cases between administrative outposts on a schedule that doesn't always align with the Vethrani inspection calendar. He came through the door the way couriers come through library doors everywhere, efficiently, with purpose, already holding out the manifest tablet, already looking for the desk. He'd been here before, or somewhere like here, enough times that the procedure was automatic. He cleared the door frame, he saw the desk, he extended the manifest. Then he saw Chalk. She had raised her head again. She was looking at him not aggressively, not with any visible alertness, just the steady, level regard of a dog who has noticed something enter the room and is observing it. Left ear up slightly, right ear flat, eyes soft. The Vethrani courier stopped moving. He was, by the standards of Vethrani couriers, a fairly experienced-looking individual. He had the slightly weathered quality of someone who has traveled a great many administrative routes in a great many outpost townships and has seen most of what there is to see in the way of minor civic surprises. He had, presumably, delivered manifests to dozens of libraries like this one. He was not, ordinarily, a person who stopped in the middle of a delivery. He stopped. He looked at Chalk. Chalk looked at him. I want to describe this as precisely as I can, because I've replayed it in my mind several times since, and I think the precision matters. It was not that Chalk looked at the courier in a way that was threatening. She did not stand up, or growl, or shift her weight, or make any sound. She was lying in the compressed jacket and she had raised her head and she was looking at him. That is the complete description of what she did. What the courier did was, he stopped. He became very still. The manifest tablet which he was still holding out toward me did not move. His eyes were quiet, not frightened exactly. Something more settled than frightened and something older, the stillness of a person who has just registered information that their body processed before their reasoning did, and who is now waiting for their reasoning to catch up. He waited for approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at me. His expression had shifted into the careful, precise blankness of someone who is maintaining professional composure through an adjustment they had not anticipated. I reached across the desk and took the manifest from him. I signed it. I handed it back. He looked at me. He looked at Chalk. He looked at me again. "Her name's Chalk," I said. "She's 11. She won't bother you." He gave a small, careful nod, the kind of nod that is doing a great deal of work. He placed the transit case on the desk with the deliberate precision of someone who is putting something down very carefully. He took his manifest back. He left. He walked backward through the door for most of it, which he would probably have told you he wasn't doing, but he was. He kept his eyes on Chalk until the door frame came between them, and then I heard his footsteps on the gravel, moving faster than they'd been moving on the way in. Chalk watched the door for a moment after he'd gone. Then she put her head back on her paws. Dial appeared in the record room doorway about 30 seconds later. He had been in there the whole time. Whether he'd heard or seen anything through the narrow window between the rooms, I didn't know. He looked at the transit case on my desk. He looked at where Chalk had been looking. Chalk had already put her head back down. Dial looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything. He held the look for a moment. There was something in it that was slightly different from the look he'd given me earlier when he'd first noticed Chalk. This look had the quality of someone who has just had a suspicion quietly confirmed, not surprised but nodding it. He was a careful man. He noted things. He went back into the record room. I opened the transit case and processed the materials inside it, routine civic updates, a correction to the zoning notation for the eastern residential boundary, a printed supplement to the current Heritage Code Index. I filed the civic updates in the appropriate binders. The zoning correction I noted in the index and put with the materials I was setting aside for Ashit's team to review, since it was relevant to the inspection scope. The Heritage Code supplement I filed in the supplemental binder on the third shelf, between the civic ordinance updates and the previous zoning notation corrections, because that was where Heritage Code supplements went. I put the empty case under the desk, next to the wall, where I keep cases until the next courier run. Chalk went back to sleep. Ashit came out for tea at the 4th hour. I had made enough for 3 and offered him a cup which he accepted, and he stood by the window again and drank it, and we had the kind of quiet, professionally cordial conversation that happens during outpost inspections. He asked how long I'd been running the library. I told him 9 years. He asked how many active borrowers we had. I told him approximately 430, which was just over half the township's population and was, by outpost library standards, a respectable number. He said something complimentary about that, in the measured way Vethrani officials say complimentary things, not warmly, but genuinely, as if the number had been entered into a ledger where good numbers go. He looked at Chalk again. She was awake, as it happened. She had raised her head at some point during his tea-making and had been looking, quietly, at the middle distance. As Ashit looked at her, she shifted her attention, not quickly, not with any visible response to his gaze, but with the gradual, unhurried reorientation of a dog who has noticed that the relevant object in the room has moved and is adjusting accordingly. She looked at him. It was not an aggressive look. It was not a frightened look. It was not a curious look, exactly, though curiosity was in there somewhere. It was the look of a very old dog who has looked at a great many things in her life and has developed, over the course of that life, a settled understanding of everything she looks at. She looked at Ashit with the flat, patient regard of an animal who had already taken his full measure in the moment he cleared the door frame, and had arrived at her conclusions, and was now simply observing the conclusions she'd already drawn. Ashit held the look for a moment. Then he said, "How old did you say?" 11, I said. He nodded. He looked at the tea in his cup. He drank some of it. These animals, the earth domestic dogs, he paused, looking for the word. The natural lifespan. Varies by size, I said. Her type, probably 12 to 15 if she stays healthy. He nodded again. You've had her the full time, the 9 years. She was here before me, I said. Hallstrom's dog originally, she just stayed. Hallstrom, he said. That would be your predecessor, the previous librarian. Yes, he retired 9 years ago. He'd been here a long time. He started when the library was new. 22 years of service, Oshit said. He was doing the arithmetic that registrar conveners do, fitting the numbers into the framework of a formal record. 22 years of building tenure, plus 11 years of the dog's life, plus the years before my tenure. He was nodding the continuity of it. And the animal was here for the latter part of his tenure. The last 2 years of it, yes. He looked at Chalk for another moment, and I watched him work through something. I could not have told you precisely what. Something in the back of his mind, in the part of the mind that keeps running even while the efficient professional parts are processing tea and compliance records. He drank the last of his tea and set the cup on the edge of the desk. "Good library," he said, and went back to the record room. I cannot tell you precisely what Oshit was thinking at this point. I can tell you what he did, which was, he finished his tea, he thanked me for it, he put the cup on the edge of my desk, and he went back into the record room. What I can tell you is that something had shifted in the quality of the silences coming from that room over the course of the afternoon. Administrative inspection silences have a texture. When the inspection is proceeding normally, when the registrar convener is working through a list of items and finding each item where it's supposed to be and ticking it and moving to the next, the silence is smooth and regular. It's the silence of efficiency. It has a rhythm to it. Periodic small sounds, the rustle of a binder being opened, the tap of a tablet being updated, the occasional low exchange between the officers. Steady, unremarkable. The silence from the record room in the 4th hour had a different texture. It was not the smooth silence of efficiency. It was the slightly slower, slightly more careful silence of people who are reading something with more attention than they expected to give it, and are being quiet in the way people are quiet when they want to think. There were fewer sounds. The rustling of binders had stopped. The tablet tapping had slowed and then paused for stretches that were longer than the normal pauses between items. Once I heard a low exchange, very quiet, below the threshold where I could make out words, and then silence again, the considered kind. Dial was part of it. He had been out twice in the 4th hour, once briefly, to refill his own teacup, which he did with the focused efficiency of someone attending to a necessary task, and returning quickly to the main one, and once to look something up in the Heritage Code supplement I had filed that morning from the courier's transit case, which he had noticed on the shelf through the narrow window between the rooms and come out to ask permission to consult, which I gave him. He'd stood at the main desk with the supplement open and read several pages of it, turning them with a care that is different from the care of someone who's checking a number. He wasn't checking a number. He was reading. He'd put it back exactly where I'd placed it, which told me he'd taken note of where it was. Then he'd gone back into the record room, and there had been a quiet conversation in there that I wasn't meant to hear, which I didn't try to hear, and then a longer silence. Chalk had been awake for most of this. She had not stood up. She had not moved from the jacket except to adjust her position once, rolling slightly onto her side, one large paw extending past the edge of the jacket onto the floor. She was breathing slowly, and her eyes were half closed, but she was not fully asleep. She was doing what very old dogs do in the late afternoon when the light shifts and the temperature drops slightly and the room gets quieter. She was resting, and she was present, and those two things were not in conflict for her. She had been resting and present in this building for 11 years, and she had no opinion about whether today was any different from the other days. It was not, from her perspective. Every day was the day she was in. She had no other days to compare it to. The young junior officer, Oshit's new appointment, came out of the record room at the 5th hour and began processing the final compliance forms at the second desk, which I'd cleared for the inspection. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone new to the process who wants to demonstrate that she knows the process. She didn't look at Chalk, which I noticed, because all of the others had looked at Chalk, and the Vethrani courier had done considerably more than look. She kept her attention on her forms. I thought about this, the not looking of her. It was not the not looking of someone who hadn't noticed the dog. It was the deliberate, maintained not looking of someone who had decided, perhaps after observing the courier's behavior, or after the quiet conversation in the record room, or simply after her own first look at Chalk when she first came through the door. That looking was not what she should be doing. That looking was the thing she'd been advised against, or had advised herself against, in the considered way of a careful new professional. She was keeping her eyes on her forms. She was being correct. Then, about 20 minutes into her work, Chalk lifted her head and looked at her. The young officer felt it. I could see it, the slight change in the set of her shoulders, the almost imperceptible pause before the next tap on the tablet. She kept her eyes on her work for another few seconds. Then she looked up. Chalk was looking at her with the same flat, patient attention she had turned on everything else in the library that day. Ears low, eyes soft, breathing steady. The young officer looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at me. "Is she started?" "She's fine," I said. The young officer looked at Chalk for another moment. Then she went back to her forms, but she didn't do it the way she'd been doing them before. She did it differently, not badly, not with less efficiency, but with the slightly adjusted quality of someone who has become aware of something in the room and has incorporated it into their understanding of the room's geography. She knew where Chalk was. She didn't look at her again, but she knew. This is the thing I've noticed over the years about Chalk's effect on people and others who haven't met her before. There are 3 responses, and almost everyone who walks through my library falls into one of them. The first response is dismissal. They see the dog, they register the dog as a dog, and they file it under the category they have for dogs, which is almost always some version of harmless domestic animal, not relevant, and they proceed. This is Oshit's response, at least initially. It is the response of someone who has read the file and believes the file. The second response is the courier response. They see the dog, something in them responds before their reasoning catches up, and they are still. They may not be able to tell you exactly why. Something old, biological, the part of the nervous system that is not concerned with current classifications, has registered something. They cannot name it. The file says subsentient, category 6, and yet. The third response is what I saw from Dial, and gradually from the young officer. They see the dog, they process the file classification, and then the dog looks at them, and they look at the dog, and something in the quality of that attention, that old, flat, settled, patient attention, causes them to quietly revise an assumption they had not previously known they were making. The third response is the slowest. It does not announce itself. It happens quietly in the back of the mind, while the official parts of the mind are doing other things. It is in some ways the most honest of the 3 responses, because it is the one that requires no dramatic incident, no confrontation, no moment of proof, no file entry that can be pointed to. It requires only sustained presence, the dog here, the person here, the accumulation of a shared room over time. Long enough that the official part of the mind gets tired of holding the category up and lets it rest. And in that moment of rest, the other part, the one that was already doing its own assessment and had its own conclusions, gets to speak. Chalk had been waiting for that moment with everyone who walked through my door. She had never hurried it along. Dial had been doing the third response since approximately the moment he first looked at Chalk, which was the moment he came through the door. He'd been doing it slowly and carefully, and without letting it interrupt his work, because Dial was a professional and professionals don't let their private revisions of assumption interfere with their efficiency. But he'd been doing it. I'd watched him doing it. In the incremental way you watch something when you're not quite sure what you're watching, but you recognize the shape of it from other times. The shape of it was someone learning something they hadn't been taught. And around the 5th hour, he emerged from the record room with his tablet and a document case, and he stood by the main desk, and he said to me, quietly enough that the young officer could not have heard him, the pre-inspection brief for Narenfall Township. It noted in the companion animal section that the library maintained a single registered domestic earth animal, terrestrial category 6. A pause. That's the full notation. Yes, I said. 11 years. 11 years, I said. He looked at Chalk for a moment. She was looking at the middle distance again. The half-open gaze, the one large paw on the floor. The Heritage Code supplement, he said. That came in today's transit case. This morning, I said. I filed it before you arrived. He nodded once. He looked down at his tablet. He looked at Chalk again. He appeared to be choosing his words with the deliberation of someone who is in a professional context and is aware of the limits of what that context permits him to say directly. The section on recognized fauna designations, he said, that's been updated. I noticed it had new entries, I said. He nodded again, more slowly. He was not going to say anything further, I could tell. He had noted what he'd noted. He had confirmed what he'd confirmed. He was a professional, and this was a conversation he was having in the margins of a professional interaction, and it was done. He gave me a look that was, in its careful brevity, doing quite a lot of work, acknowledging that I was an intelligent person who could read the supplement myself, and that we both knew what the supplement contained, and that neither of us needed to elaborate on it in this particular context. He went back into the record room. I sat at my desk for a moment and thought about what Dial had said, and what he hadn't said, and what the Heritage Code supplement had contained that had caused him to read several pages of it standing at my desk in the middle of an administrative inspection. Then I got up and retrieved the supplement from where I'd filed it and opened it to the section on recognized fauna designations. It was, as I've said, updated. There were new entries. I read the new entries. I'm not going to reproduce them here in full, because they are written in the specific terminology of the Vethrani Heritage Code, which is not ordinary reading. But the substance of them was this: a revision to the criteria for heritage classification status, specifically the subsection dealing with species of notable autonomic behavioral profile that had been present in a civic zone for a significant period without active intervention. There was a passage in the revised subsection dealing with the distinction between current classification grade and historical assessment, and it contained a note that referenced an earlier classification review, a formal review of a formal record, conducted in 1987 and subsequently sealed. The note did not describe the content of the sealed review. It referenced the year and the sealed designation, and said that the criteria then applied for downward classification had since been revised in response to documented fieldwork. 1987. I looked at Chalk. She had stood up. This happened sometimes in the late afternoon, the long, slow climb from sleep onto the broad, steady pause, the full-body stretch that works through her from nose to tail, end to end, every joint. She stretched for a long moment with the total and unself-conscious thoroughness of a dog who does not perform anything. Then she stood at her full height, which is not large, as I've said, but is somehow always more than you expect when you see it after she's been curled up, and she looked at me. I looked back at her. I know, I said, which was not a statement I could have defended, but was the only thing I had. She walked out from behind the returns desk and came to stand beside me. I put my hand on the top of her head between the ears, in the place she'd always liked, and she leaned into it slightly, the way she'd leaned into it for 11 years. Her eyes were closed. I heard the record room door. Ashit came out. He was carrying his document case in both hands, closed. The young officer came out behind him, tablet under her arm, and then Dial, who was the last and who was not carrying anything. Ashit looked at me. He looked at the Heritage Code supplement on my desk, which I had not had time to put back. He looked at Chalk, who was standing beside me with my hand on her head. It was a different look from the look he'd given her in the morning, and different again from the look after tea. The morning look was dismissal. The afternoon tea look was the beginning of the third response. This look was the third response completed. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way people look at something when they have stopped using the part of their mind that holds categories and are using the part that simply sees. There was nothing performative in it. He was not making a show of reassessing. He was simply looking, in the way of someone who has come to a conclusion and is confirming it, quietly and without ceremony. Chalk looked at him. The flat, settled regard, the soft eyes, the large, quiet pause on the floor. She was not doing anything. She had never done anything from his perspective. She had slept under the desk and yawned and walked over to stand next to her librarian, and these were not aggressive acts, and they were not fearful acts, and they were not even particularly significant acts. They were the acts of an old dog in a familiar place. Ashit said, "The library's records are in order." "Thank you," I said. "The zoning compliance is complete." A pause. "There may be a minor amendment to the classification notation. My office will file the paperwork." "Of course," I said. He looked at Chalk for another moment. He looked at me. "She's been here 11 years, you said." 11 years, I said. He nodded. He picked up his document case and tucked it under his arm. He looked around the library with a slight change in his expression, not dramatic, not the expression of someone who has undergone a revelation. The expression of someone who is quietly, efficiently updating a ledger, entering a number, moving it from one column to another. The expression of a professional who has encountered information that does not fit the existing category and has decided, without drama, to create the correct category and file the information in it. "Good library," he said. He went to the door and went through it. The young officer followed. Dial was last. At the door he paused and looked back at Chalk one more time. Chalk was looking at him. He held her gaze for a second. Then he gave a small, precise nod, the kind of nod you give to something that you respect, which is different from the kind you give to something you simply acknowledge. It was the nod of one professional to another. The nod of someone who recognizes, across whatever distance of category and classification separates them, that the thing they are looking at has been here longer than the paperwork, and has been more than the paperwork said, and has not required any of them to be told so. Then he went through the door. I heard the carrier warm up. I heard the tonal shift as the dampening systems cut in, and then the lower register of departure. I stood at the main desk for a moment, listening to the sound of the carrier moving off along the transit path, and then the silence that came after it. Chalk had gone back to the returns desk. She turned twice, in the way she does, and lay down on the compressed jacket and put her head on her paws. She was asleep within 3 minutes. I put the kettle on. I did the filing that had accumulated over the course of the afternoon. The compliance forms the young officer had completed and left in the outbox. The transit case materials I hadn't yet finished processing. The Heritage Code supplement that I put back in exactly the right place in the supplemental binder, which is the third shelf on the right, between the civic ordinance updates and the zoning notation corrections. I sat at my desk with fresh tea and looked at the far wall of the library, which has a long window that faces the gravel path, and through which, in the late afternoon when the sky is clear, you can see the gap in the hydroponics fence in the field beyond it, where the grass grows in thick pale clumps and the light goes golden at this time of day. I like this window. I've always liked it. It's the reason I do most of my cataloging in the late afternoon, when I can look up from the tablet and see that field. I thought about 1987. I am 57 years old, which means I was not alive in 1987, and neither was Chalk, and neither was anyone currently in this township who might have known what happened in that year that merited a formal record review, a sealed classification, and a subsequent revision of the criteria that had been used in it. I did not know what had been in that library in 1987, or in what building it had occupied before the current one was built. I did not know who had done the review or what they had reviewed. I did not know what had caused the criteria to be revised in the field work that came later. What I knew was this: sometime before my grandmother was born, someone in the Vethrani archival system had looked at something that was present here in this place, in the ordinary way that things are present in ordinary places, and had made a classification. had filed it, had sealed the file, had presumably believed that was the end of it. And then the criteria had changed. There is a particular kind of institutional error that happens when a classification is made, and then filed, and then forgotten. The error is not in the original classification, necessarily. The original classification may have been consistent with the criteria then in use, may have been applied in perfect good faith by a careful person who did everything correctly by the standards of their time and their system. The error is in the assumption that the classification settles something, that the filing of a conclusion is the same as the resolution of the question, that a sealed record is a closed matter, that you can look at a thing, make a note about the thing, put the note in a drawer, and then the thing becomes what you wrote about it. The thing does not become what you wrote about it. The thing remains what it is. It has no investment in your notes. It has not been informed of your conclusions, and if it had been, it would not find them particularly relevant. It is simply present in the way it has always been present, doing what it does in the room you share with it for as long as you share it, which in some cases is longer than anyone planned for when they first made the note. The matter is not in the record. The matter is in the room. It has always been in the room. It was in the room in 1987, and in the years before that, and in the years since, and it was in the room this Tuesday in the form of an 11-year-old mixed-breed dog sleeping on a compressed canvas jacket under the returns desk of a small outpost library. The room had not changed its mind about what it contained. It had simply waited for the paperwork to catch up. The notification from Oshit's office arrived 3 days later. It was a standard administrative amendment form, the kind filed for minor civic classification adjustments, which happen regularly in outpost townships and are generally unremarkable. This one was not unremarkable, though it was written in the language of unremarkable things. The amendment reclassified the Narenfall Township Lending Library as a protected civic site under Vethrani Heritage Code 7, subparagraph 4. Heritage Code 7 is the code for sites of significant continuous presence. Subparagraph 4 is the subparagraph dealing with sites that have demonstrated what the code calls an uninterrupted stewardship function of recognized cultural and social value to the resident population. The library was, in the plain language of the amendment, now protected. This meant it could not be demolished, relocated, rezoned, or otherwise interfered with without a formal heritage review process that, in practice, took years and almost never resulted in demolition. The building was protected. The collection was protected. The civic record was protected. Chalk was not mentioned in the amendment. She didn't need to be. I read the amendment twice, slowly, sitting at the main desk with the morning tea in my hand, and Chalk asleep under the returns desk 3 meters away. I read the referenced subsections. I noted the classification code. I noted that the code had been assigned. According to the amendment's own metadata, after a heritage assessment conducted during the inspection, which meant Oshit had begun the paperwork before he left. Before he got back in his carrier and departed, he had made his decision in the library. He had looked at Chalk and looked at the Heritage Code supplement and spoken to Dial, and then he had begun the paperwork. He had not been asked to. No one had argued the point. I had not said anything. Chalk had not done anything. She had simply been here. She had simply been here for 11 years, in this building, in the ordinary way of old dogs in familiar places, present and quiet and unhurried, and watching everything with the patient attention that old dogs have when they have lived long enough in one place to have made their final decision about it. She had slept through 312 administrative interactions in 9 years, by my rough count. She had yawned at 7 different Vethrani officials. She had been classified 4 times as Category 6, non-concern, by assessors who had read the file. She had been classified before that, presumably, by whoever it was who filed the 1987 review, by whoever found the criteria insufficient after. She had not been informed of any of these classifications. She didn't care. She had never cared. The classifications were not about her, from her perspective. They were about the people making them, and whether those people were going to be interesting, and whether this room was safe, and whether the jacket was comfortable, and whether the girl who'd brought her tea this morning, the young officer who'd come back in to collect a binder she'd forgotten, and who'd paused by the returns desk on the way out and looked at Chalk with that uncertain, revised expression, and then bent down and held the back of her hand out, which Chalk had allowed to be sniffed, and then petted, which Chalk had tolerated with benign and dignified patience, was someone worth paying attention to. Most things, Chalk had concluded, were not worth urgency, were not worth argument, were not worth agitation or announcement. The room knew what it knew. It had always known. I put the amendment in the heritage binder. I put the heritage binder back on the shelf. I noted the amendment number in the index in the top drawer of the main desk. Then I sat down and got back to work. Chalk slept. I have thought about this in the months since, about what Oshett wrote in his amendment, and what the Heritage Code supplement contained, and what the sealed 1987 review must have found, and what it means that the criteria for that review were subsequently revised. I have thought about what the Vethrani courier saw when he came through the door, and what made him walk backward out of it, and why Dial began reading the supplement with the care of someone reading a thing that matters. I have not reached a conclusion I can state with confidence. I have my suspicion, which is not the same thing. My suspicion is that someone in 1987, in some building in this township or in the vicinity of it, looked at something, an animal or animals, and made a record and made a classification, and believed that the classification settled it. And whatever was recorded in that sealed file had spent the years since then being present, quietly, in the way that things that are not worried about their classification are present, not threatening, not announcing, just here, doing what they do, in the spaces that people occupy and eventually stop looking at because people stop looking at things they've already classified. The thing about a very old file is that it doesn't close the question. It closes the paperwork. The question is in the room. Chalk turned over in her sleep and made a small sound, which is a thing she does sometimes, a low, brief, almost conversational sound, as if something is happening in whatever dogs dream about. I looked at her. The gray muzzle, the long ears pressed against the jacket, the large, quiet paws. I thought about what Oshett had seen when he looked at her, about the precise, unhurried way he had looked, after he'd read whatever Dial had shown him, and after he'd looked at the Heritage Code supplement, and after he'd put all of that together with the 11 years and the empty classification form, and the Vethrani courier who had walked backward out of my door without quite admitting that's what he was doing. I thought about what Oshett had decided, standing in my library in the late afternoon, while the light went golden through the western window, and Chalk stood beside me with her eyes closed and my hand between her ears. He had looked at her for a long time, and then he had begun the paperwork. Not because she had growled, not because she had done anything at all. She had done nothing. She had been here for 11 years in the ordinary way, and she had looked at him with the settled, patient regard of an old dog who has already decided everything about a room and does not need to do anything further. That was enough. I don't know what the classification will say when Oshett's formal assessment is complete. I don't know what language it will use, or which section of the Heritage Code it will cite, or whether the sealed 1987 review will be referenced. I know that Dial will have contributed to it, because Dial is the kind of careful, considered assessor who does not leave relevant information out of formal reports. I know that whatever it says will not change anything that happens in this library on an ordinary day. The books will be where they are. The borrowers will come and go. The civic record binders will sit on the third shelf from the right. The index will be in the top drawer. And Chalk will sleep under the returns desk. She will sleep under the returns desk until she cannot any more. And then I will fold a fresh jacket and sit on the floor next to her and tell her she's been a good girl, which she has, And after that I will open the library every morning and work through every day and look out the long window at the late afternoon light on the pale grass. And I will miss her, as you miss the particular presence of a particular creature who was present in your life for a long time. But for now she is here. She is here, and she is warm, and she is breathing slowly on the folded canvas jacket. And whatever she is in the heritage code, whatever she is in the sealed file, whatever she was in 1987 and was before that, and will be in the records that Ashit will file in the coming weeks. Here, in the building she has lived in for 11 years, she is simply chalk. My dog. Asleep. The library is quiet. The late light is on the wall. The township is outside, ordinary and small, and going about its evening. I have 3 loan requests to process and a binder to update and a notation to make in the civic index, and I will do all of them, and I will lock up when the work is done. And I will walk home along the gravel path behind the community hall, and Chalk will walk beside me. And the stars above the hydroponics fence will be very clear, as they are on evenings like this. The Vethrani closed the Earth Animal file in 1987. Chalk had not read the file. She has never read any file. She does not need to.